Hmong, a hidden history. Hmong are thought to have come from Eurasia and then moved down to live in China. They have a tonal dialect like most other Asian languages that they may have adopted when living in China. They never assimilated with the Chinese and kept their own culture. Chinese forcibly have attempted to remove the Hmong from their country multiple times but have been defeated by the Hmong minority. The Chinese eventually tricked and murdered the royal Hmong family, dispersing the Hmong clans and enslaving the rest. Under Chinese control, the Hmong were forced to stop using their written language, and it has been lost. Many Hmong fled China and moved south mainly to northern Vietnam and Laos. Here they took residence up in the mountains where they could live peacefully. The Lao and Vietnamese usually stayed in the lowlands, but despised the Hmong living in their countries in the highlands. In the late 1800s, French gained control of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and taxed the Hmong through the growing of opium. The majority of the Hmong under General To Li Phong sided with the French and fought with them against the Lao and Vietnamese nationalists and later the Japanese who invaded during World War II. As the spread of communism threatens to envelop South and Southeast Asia, the United States goes to war in Vietnam in 1955. Laos was declared neutral the year prior in 1954, but the U.S. continuously sends aid to the Royal Lao Army attempting to defeat the communist Pathet Lao aligned with the Viet Minh. The U.S. trains the Thai paramilitary to use weapons, fly airplanes, and in parachute landings. Because of the Hmong's ties to the French, the Viet Minh see them as the enemy and seek to eliminate them. Hmong General Vang Pao of the Royal Lao Army, following To Li Phong's involvement with the French, agrees to fight the communist forces in Laos if the U.S. agrees to supply the Hmong with weapons, aid, and food. The Americans look to the Hmong to help them keep the Viet Minh from gaining access to the Viet Minh Trail in Laos, while the Hmong look to the Americans to supply them with weapons to fight both the Viet Minh and the Pathet Lao. The Americans train the Hmong by way of the Thai paramilitary in artillery, hand weapons, piloting, and making landing strips for planes carrying supplies. On January 27, 1973, the Royal Lao government and the Pathet Lao agreed to cease fire, ending the Civil War. Yet there were thousands of communist Viet Minh troops still in Laos, threatening those supporting the Americans. Saigon in central Vietnam falls to the communist Viet Minh April 30, 1975. In Laos on May 11 through the 14th, 2,500 Hmong high-ranking military personnel and their families get evacuated to Thailand. Those not airlifted had to seek their own refuge by hiding out in the mountains of Laos and making the dangerous journey to Thailand refugee camps by foot and crossing the Mekong River while being hunted out by communist Viet Minh and Pathet Lao forces. Almost all Hmong refugees who made it to Thailand ended up in Ban Vinai, a refugee camp established by the UN hosting more than 40,000 people by the 1990s. Most Hmong would spend years living in Ban Vinai after spending years trapped in the jungle trying to reach Thailand from Laos. Many applied to be relocated to America, while a few are granted relocation to France, Canada, and Australia. Ban Vinai closed in 1983, and the last relocation camp was closed in 1996. Those left were forced to return to communist Laos or try to be granted asylum in the U.S. During the Bush administration, the U.S. supported and gave money to the Lao government to repatriate the Hmong back into the communist country. The Hmong living abroad and in Thailand at the camps were horrified at having to forcibly return to the country that sought to exterminate them. Of the 350,000 Hmong in Laos before the war, 17,000 soldiers died, not accounting for civilian losses. Around 100,000 Hmong relocated to refugee camps in Thailand. Laos was recorded as the most heavily bombed locations in world history in 1968. It has now been acknowledged that the Pathet Lao and the Viet Minh forces used chemical warfare against the Hmong in Laos and Thailand. 130,000 Hmong have come as refugees to the United States from 1965 until the late 1990s. They came to the U.S. because the CIA had promised to house them in their own country if the U.S. was unsuccessful in defeating the communist force in Laos and Vietnam in exchange for the Hmong fighting their secret war. Many thought the U.S. could not be defeated and expected to return to their homelands in Laos as free people. Hmong arrive as refugees to the United States and are very ill prepared by the U.S. government to adjust to their very different lifestyle in big cities. Many receive food stamps and go onto welfare because finding a job without knowledge of the language or the culture is quite difficult. This is hard to fathom for the Hmong, who usually work 7 days a week farming using slash and burn technique. Because of the secrecy of the war the Hmong fought for the Americans in Laos, many civilians do not understand 1. Why the Hmong have arrived, 2. Who they are and where they come from, and 3. Why they are so unprepared to live in the United States. There are no veterans benefits for the soldiers who fought in Laos. Very little information done by anthropologists about the Hmong in either Southeast Asia or the United States. Most information I have been able to access is by journalists, missionaries, and Americans who have befriended the Hmong when they came to the U.S. The best information is the books now published by the Hmong themselves, recounting their history and or their parents' plight in Laos. The story of the Hmong brings to light the complication and misunderstanding of the Western ideology and its own personal interests when dealing with Southeast Asia and communism. Such as in anthropological history, the colonial forces observing indigenous peoples cannot separate their own biases or give an account true to the real cultural significances that a person inside that particular culture can. As in the past, the Hmong are very good at keeping their shamanistic rituals, their language, practicing animal sacrifices for ceremonies, cultivating healing herbs, and keeping the celebration of their New Year's alive. While some are converts of the Christian faith, most still participate in Hmong ceremonies, such as soul callings. In America is so different from what the Hmong know. There are cities and bills to be paid instead of mountains and rights to be collected. They have been stripped of their own cultural roles in American society and live without receiving any recognition from the U.S. or its people of the thousands of lives lost and sacrifices made fighting for America. What does it say about American society that the Hmong are a misunderstood people? What other minorities are the majority of the U.S. citizens ignoring and using to their advantage that they are attempting to be hidden from us? What role do anthropologists play in exposing, documenting, perhaps trying to prevent these same fatal periods in history from repeating themselves?